Hello and happy December 3rd to everyone. If you're ready for our third story, today I'm going to be sharing, look at this. Have you ever heard the phrase, you can't judge a book by its cover? Well, this is one of those books that you can't judge by its cover. You're used to seeing maybe a picture or some of the characters in the story on the front of the cover so that you can decide whether or not you want to read this book. But this book has lost its cover. The only way you can see the title is by looking at it this way. It's The Amazing Christmas Extravaganza by David Shannon. And I'm really excited to share it with you. Let me flip my camera so that we can get started. I think this is the right way. Mrs. Clark is still getting used to using this camera. All right, we have, whoops, now I've got my book upside down. We're all lifelong learners, aren't we? All right, The Amazing Christmas Extravaganza by David Shannon. And he's another one of those amazing author illustrators that not only writes the incredible story, but also does the beautiful pictures. Now, I'll show you in a minute something interesting about the illustrations for this book. It all started with one little tiny string of white Christmas lights. In the past, Mr. Merriweather had been happy celebrating Christmas with his wife and their children, Matthew and Sarah. Each year, he made a big show of getting the box of ornaments down from the attic. Then the Merriweather family decorated the tree together and hung a wreath on the front door. But this Christmas was different. This year, we're really going to celebrate Christmas, he announced. This year, we're going to put lights on the house. They were all very excited. Mrs. Merriweather clapped her hands, and Sarah hopped on one foot. Then Mr. Merriweather hauled his ladder outside and tacked up a small string of white lights around the front window. "That's fine," he said, admiring his handiwork. And he left the lights on all night so he could see the glow from his bedroom, and he went to sleep a happy man. Now notice on this side of the page where the writing is, the picture that goes around the writing is going to change as the story goes on. Here you see one strand of small white Christmas lights. That's kind of a shrimpy little string of lights you got there, pal. Mr. Merriweather stopped shoveling and turned to see Mr. Clack, his neighbor from across the street. "Well, you see, my house," Mr. Clack bragged. "I got 17 strings of lights, and they blink on and off." Mr. Merriweather was suddenly embarrassed. "Well, I'm not done yet. You wait until I'm finished, and then I guess you'll see something." He pulled his hat down over his ears and went back to his shoveling. Notice it's got colored lights now. That afternoon, Mr. Merriweather gathered up his kids and drove the station wagon to 5 big department stores. He bought so many Christmas decorations that he couldn't close the tailgate. He could hardly wait to get home and put them all up. "Can we really afford all that?" Mrs. Merriweather asked when she saw the decorations. "Of course we can, honey," Mr. Merriweather said. "It's Christmas." That night, he peeked out his bedroom window and saw Mr. Clack staring up at the new display. He chuckled to himself when Mr. Clack kicked some snow and stomped home. All the next day, Mr. Merriweather's neighbors stopped by to tell him how wonderful his house looked. He had never gotten so many compliments. They made him feel giddy and full inside, like he'd just eaten a big dinner. But still, he thought, there was room for improvement. Every morning for the next week, Mr. Merriweather fired up the old station wagon and went in search of more decorations, which he carefully added to the house with the seriousness of a true artist. And every evening, the neighbors and their kids came out to see the new wonders sprouting from the House of Lights. "Magnificent!" the neighbors exclaimed. "Awesome!" Matthew's and Sarah's friends told them they were lucky to have such a great dad. "Yeah," Matthew said, a little puzzled. "He's really something." Mrs. Merriweather tried to be understanding, but she was worried. Christmas Day would be here soon, and it seemed that her husband could only think of colored lights and plastic candles. She was relieved when Mr. Merriweather had told her he'd been to every store he could find and there was nothing left to buy. Then she heard the hammer banging and the saw buzzing in the garage. Several days later, Mr. Merriweather unveiled what he had made. "It's truly an extravaganza," the neighbors gasped. Mr. Merriweather flipped a switch, and a recording of the 12 Days of Christmas blared out of the loudspeakers. Life-size wooden cutouts filled the yard, representing each of the 12 days. There were maids a-milking. There were geese a-laying, lords a-leaping, and even a partridge in a pear tree. "And this is nothing!" shouted Mr. Merriweather. "You should see what I'm building next!" "Terrific," muttered Mr. Clack. "I like celebrating Christmas as much as the next guy, but this is ridiculous." Mr. Merriweather was no longer thinking about Christmas, however. He was thinking about bigger, brighter, and more. The next night, Mr. Merriweather was back at work on his extravaganza. "You better come down now, dear," Mrs. Merriweather called up to him. "The children are in the Christmas program tonight." "Sorry, no time," Mr. Merriweather mumbled through a mouthful of nails. "I've got too much to do. You go on without me." It was hopeless. Mrs. Merriweather tried to explain to Matthew and Sarah that their father was a very busy man. "I think he's gone a little wacko," Matthew said. "Hush," his mother scolded. "Don't talk about your father that way." Whoa, I gotta turn the book for this one. Mr. Merriweather's display continued to grow. One day he put up Santa's workshop, complete with elves. The next day he added giant snowmen made of styrofoam. And finally he built a 50-foot Santa with a mechanical arm that waved. Just imagine if that was next door to you. People from 3 counties away brought their children to see the now famous Merriweather front yard. But it wasn't so much fun anymore for the people who lived nearby. The extravaganza used so much electricity that there was hardly any left for the neighbors. Their Christmas trees were dim and dull, and their Christmas cookies came out doughy from ovens that wouldn't heat. The noise from the sightseers honking and yelling was so loud that the annual Christmas caroling had to be canceled. No one could hear the singers. People visiting their families got stranded for hours in the tangle of traffic. Sometimes they just gave up and went home. Mr. Merriweather didn't even notice. He sat snugly in his brightly lit home, humming along with the 12 Days of Christmas. Finally, the neighbors decided something had to be done. On Christmas Eve, they held a meeting at Mr. Clack's house. "Let's call the cops," someone shouted. "Let's take him to court," screamed another. "Now, wait a minute," said Mr. Clack. "We don't want to look like a bunch of Scrooges." Just then, all the lights in the neighborhood went out. Up and down the street, everything was black. Everything, that is, except the Christmas extravaganza, which glowed brighter than ever. That's the last straw, roared Mr. Clack. I don't care what people think. I say we tear it down ourselves, tonight. Everyone yelled in agreement, and then they armed themselves with tools of destruction and swarmed over Mr. Merryweather's front yard, slashing, bashing, and trashing everything in sight. Mr. Merryweather and his wife woke up in mid-air. "Oh, my! Oh, no!" he wailed. "What is it?" cried the children, running into the room. "I think it's an earthquake," Mr. Merryweather exclaimed. They all dove under the bed and huddled there together, listening to the terrible screeching, cracking, and thumping. It lasted all night long. Finally, the noises stopped. Mr. Merryweather poked his head out from under his bed. It was morning. Christmas morning. He ran down the stairs, opened the front door, and couldn't believe what he saw. The Christmas extravaganza was gone. Yesterday, giant snowflakes, Santa Clauses, reindeer, and lights had decorated his house and yard. Now there was only a huge pile of sputtering rubble. Mr. Clack and the rest of the mob were still standing around. Their heavy breaths steamed in the cold morning air. "I guess that'll teach you to muck up our neighborhood," Mr. Clack sneered. Mr. Merryweather felt like he'd been hit by a log. He could barely talk. But I was just celebrating Christmas," he said. "I didn't know it bothered you. I thought you liked it." The neighbors were silent. No longer caught up in their attack, they looked at each other and began to think about what they had done. And they were ashamed. "I'm sorry," Mr. Clack said sheepishly. He picked up a pair of broken reindeer antlers. "Here," he said, "we'll help you put it all back together again. We'll make it even better." Mr. Merryweather shook his head. "No," he said, "I think some nice little white lights will do just fine." And he pulled the tiny string out of the smoking heap, and Mr. Clack and all the neighbors helped him tack it up around the front window. Mrs. Merryweather brought out cups of hot cider, and the whole neighborhood admired Mr. Merryweather's little string of white lights, his fine tree, and his beautiful wreath. "You know, Mr. Merryweather," Mr. Clack said, "that really was an amazing Christmas extravaganza." "Thank you," replied Mr. Merryweather, "but these are my real masterpieces." He hugged Matthew and swung Sarah high up into the air. Mrs. Merryweather took her husband by the arm. "Don't feel bad, dear," she said. "Everybody should be able to celebrate Christmas in his own way, whether it's with lots of lights or none at all. Yours just got so big there wasn't room for anyone else." "Well, I've learned my lesson," Mr. Merryweather said with a sigh. "I guess I got carried away." "I think everyone did," Mrs. Merryweather said. "But I'm proud of you. I didn't know you were so artistic." Mr. Merryweather smiled. He gazed at his children, his friends, and his big mound of junk. He noticed that several large pieces of wood were still in good condition. He wondered out loud. How many days until Easter? Wasn't that a great story? See, you can't judge a book by its cover. I hope you liked it. I'll see you tomorrow for the next story.